Okay. Good morning. Today is August 28th, 2023, and my name is Ebony Love. I'm recording this oral history via Zoom with Professor Kenneth Nunn. I am physically located in Jacksonville, Florida. And Professor Nunn, can you start by telling me where you're physically located?
I'm physically located in Washington, D.C.
Okay. And so my first question is, how did you know that you wanted to be a lawyer?
Well, that's a good question. I didn't know for quite some time. I don't think I settled on being a lawyer until I got into undergraduate. When I was growing up, I didn't know any African American lawyers. I didn't know of any that existed, not alone people I knew or didn't know. I just hadn't heard of an African American person being a lawyer. And so it wasn't something that I could think of myself doing or being involved in. So, it wasn't on my radar. I didn't start thinking about being a lawyer until I went to Stanford. And when I was there, I think we had a fairly tight African American community, and a lot of the students there were doing, things after graduation. And I would say the most of them were either going to be engineers or doctors or lawyers. And so engineering and medicine were off of my agenda, just from the math. It wasn't something I had aptitude for. So I thought about being a lawyer, and I think when I graduated, I took a year off. And I wound up working in for the library, the county library in Alameda County, which is Oakland. And as part of that, I went into various prisons. The Alameda County prison, there's a federal correctional institute in Pleasanton and different places. And I would go in there and bring books. But, and I started thinking more, because when I did that after I graduated, because I took a year off and I wasn't sure I really wanted to go to law school. I was thinking about going to graduate school to get a PhD and, in some other subject. So I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. And I think it was after I did that, I kind of, and then hanging out with some of my former classmates who were at Berkeley. And I said, I could see myself doing this. I think this might be fun. It might fit my interests. And so that's how I came to focus on going to law school.
And so did your parents go to college, and did your parents go to college?
No, I
Okay.
was, well, let me rephrase that. My mother got a nursing degree, which basically would be equivalent to having a what do they call that when you get from community college, like an AA degree? What is that? I don't know what that stands for, but basically she had that. So she had gone to some post-secondary education. I wouldn't necessarily call it college. And I think that of the family that I was aware of, I was probably the second person to go to college in my family, both on my mother's and my father's side.
And how did you end up at Stanford? Because I know nothing about the West Coast, but Stanford is one of the colleges that you hear about as is it an Ivy League, or is it just
it would be considered Ivy League plus. Ivy League is, technically just the schools that are in a certain athletic conference called the Ivy League. And I don't know how many, I think there's like maybe 8 schools that are, technically Ivy League. But if we're talking about elite schools that are top schools in the United States, then Stanford's probably on everybody's list, as one of either the top 3 or the top 5 schools in the country. Now, I didn't know any of that when I went to Stanford. Why did I go to Stanford? I went to Stanford because I played high school football. And when I played high school football, I was fairly good. I had honorable mention in our local municipal conference in Omaha, Nebraska. A lot of good football players come out of Omaha. So, I was pretty decent if I was, at that point. But I didn't get any offers at any Division I schools. That's what they called them at the time. And, I was thinking about places I could walk on to. And in those days, Nebraska was really good. Nebraska was like, Florida or Alabama is now. And I was like, well, I'm not going to go there. But I was trying to think of schools that I could walk on to. Stanford had sent me, let me just back up a little bit. When I was in 11th grade, I took the PSAT. And as a result of my score, I started getting applications and materials from different colleges around the country. And I, look at them, and I'd seen Stanford's brochure because it was, it was misleading, but it was very, very pretty, very green. I was like, wow, that's California. That's nice. I bet there are some pretty girls in California. So I want to go to California. But then I was thinking about, well, I want to play football. And Stanford was a Division I school, and they were playing in what was then the Pac-10 conference. But they were, not that good. They were getting beat. They got beat by Michigan that year, something like 53-0. And I said, I could probably play for them. So, I got out I wrote them and I said, hey, I'm honorable mention, this and that. They said, well, you can walk on for the JV team. We'd be happy to have you. So I said, well, I guess, and then, I got a scholarship because I was Pole. And they were, in those days, affirmative action was, a thing they liked. They weren't that gung-ho in it. There weren't that many people they were letting into these places, but they let a few. And, I had, they offered me a scholarship. I thought I could walk on to the football team. I thought it had a pretty campus, and I thought, maybe there'd be some pretty girls there. But I didn't know much else about Stanford. I definitely did not know Stanford was an elite school, because if I'd known that, I wouldn't have gone. So it just, shows you how sometimes things just work out for you, or sometimes, God is looking out for you when you're not looking out for yourself. Because I got there and I was like, oh man, there's a bunch of nerds here. But, it turned out well for me. And actually, as what I really was a Black little nerdy kid, who, I think I fit right in. There's a community of people that I fit right into. And, I could say, everybody that I know who's an African-American isn't somebody who's afraid to read or isn't not interested in, the life of the mind, or reading books, or, solving problems and being involved with computers. And I mean, there are a lot of real high achieving Black folks that I got a chance to spend time with and choose as role models and things like that. So, it worked out real well for me.
And how was your experience at Stanford?
Well, it's funny, when I was there, I can't say I really liked it. I remember going home after for the first like holiday break. And I went home and I was telling one of my friends, we were riding around in his car, and I was like, man, I don't like it. It's just like a whole bunch of white folks, and, everybody is, nerdy and this, that, and the other. And I didn't really, and then, like I said, it was supposed to be green and lush, but actually they were in the middle of a drought and it was brown and dusty. So I was like, I don't know if I like it. And then he said to me, yeah, we all knew you were coming back. You weren't going to make it there, blah, blah, blah. And that just made me mad. So I said, I'm going to tough it out. So I went back. But I made a lot of friends at Stanford. I think, I had a good time, and I, was engaged in some activities. I got involved in, the anti-apartheid movement there, and wound up getting arrested at a student sit-in. And, I really, found some things that, inspired me and encouraged me to, become an activist and become interested in social justice issues and trying to make the world a better place. So that, at the end of the day, it worked out. I think that I enjoyed it. And the other thing is, there's a woman who's in my class what's funny is there's a woman in my class who married a man who became president of Morehouse. And then there's a woman in the class ahead of me who married a man who became president of Morehouse. So there's kind of this Black female Morehouse male kind of pipeline for a period of time that was there. And so I asked my friend, whose name was Cheryl at one point, and her kids, I was trying to think where my daughters were going to go to school. And I was asking Cheryl, I said, well, why did you send your kids to Stanford when your husband was president of Morehouse? How'd they get away? At least the son, the daughter, I guess could have gone to Spelman. And she told me, she said, well, Kenneth, you know what it was like when we were there. And I said, yeah. She says, well, pretty much Stanford is kind of like a HBCU that has resources, at least for the Black kids, because they were a private school, they were not disinterested in doing things for Black students in the way that I would say the University of Florida has always been disinterested in doing anything for Black students here. We had a Black activity center, we had Black faculty and staff, we had a Black theme dorm, we had, a Black theater, group, and they had their own little house called Harmony House where they would do things. There was the Black House where people would gather. There was a Black activity center where people would do usually volunteer work in East Palo Alto and East Oakland and other places where there were African Americans. So I felt like I had kind of a nice cocoon with people who cared about me to support me and encourage me when I was there. And, I think that turned out well for me, and, led me to send my daughter out there for school, and she had a, similar experience and enjoyed it as well. So I hope I answered the question. I don't even remember what you asked me now.
You did. It actually just spurred more questions, which is why I grabbed something to write with. So you kind of, you raised 3 questions for me, but I'm going to ask them in very different order. You had said, you learned what it meant to be an activist while you were at Stanford. How would you describe what an activist is, or what does it mean to you to be an activist?
What it means to me is that people, we focus a lot on individuality in our culture and society today. And the reality is that people are not, they are individuals and they have individual aspects to themselves, but people really are social beings and they work in collectives. And so the question is, when something happens, whether we talk about a new dance or whether we're talking about new social issues, new politics, new ways of engaging and with each other, those things are collective things. There has to be something that makes the group move in a particular direction, to pick up a new skill, to pick up a new worldview or something. And the question then becomes, how does that happen? And I started thinking about that question. How do you motivate people to do things? And I think that's what the role of an activist is, what we normally do is we just accept the fact that there are politicians or government officials or school officials or whatever, people in charge who run things and they tell us what to do. Our pastor tells us what to do. But at some point in time, somebody created that church that pastor is part of. And at some point in time, somebody created the religion that the pastor adheres to. And somebody had to make that process happen. And all of those people, somebody had to start the United States of America or whatever country you happen to be in. All of these things are started by activists. They're people who begin pushing and moving and leading people in a different direction. And at that time, I was very interested in, the Black Power movement and movements for social justice. And as I said, the anti-apartheid movement and things like that. And we had a lot of meetings about what needed to be done and why it was terrible that these things were happening in Johannesburg and what kind of way was that related to things that were happening to African Americans, although we just said Black people at that point. That was before Jesse pushed this African American term. But we were like, we're all Black people and we're all getting the short end of the stick. And why is that happening? And do we want that to continue? And no, we don't. And we want to stop it. And what do we need to do to stop it? And so that's what I think an activist is and what an activist does. And for most of my life, I've been thinking about how I could be an activist on the issues that matter to me. I mean, I think one of the reasons I wound up in Florida, of course, was because my wife, Patricia, went to Florida State to get her PhD. But in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, well, it's one thing to be an activist in places like California or Washington, D.C., where I was at the time, but the bulk of us live in the South. And if I haven't experienced the South, and I don't know what it's like for African Americans, in their daily life and practice and the types of things that they actually are committed to and thinking about, if I don't know that except for theoretically, how can I then see myself as a person who could take on the mantle of Black leadership in some way, shape, form, or fashion without being there? And so that had a lot to do with it for me.
Really quickly, you said Jesse had popularized the term African American. You're talking about Jesse Jackson, correct?
Right, that's right.
Okay, and so I don't know, I'm going to contextualize this conversation. We're talking on Monday, August 28th, 2023. 60 years ago on August 26, 1963, there was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom that was organized by A. Philip Randolph, who was from Jacksonville, Florida.
Yep.
At that march, there were many different speeches. Unfortunately, the most popular speech was Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And I say unfortunately because there was so much more that went into that walk and that mission. And it was really grassroots movements coming to Washington, D.C. to demand better treatment for social inequalities. And so to further contextualize this, 2 days ago, a gunman from Clay County, Florida, came to Jacksonville, Florida. First, he stopped at Edward Waters University, which I can see out of my window, and he was turned away by a security guard. And then he went about 5 minutes, not even 5 minutes away, to a Dollar General and created a mass shooting, and he killed 3 Black people. And so my question is, you kind of talked about
intentionally Black people,
because he said, if you're not white or something like that, like leave the building. But you said that part of being an activist is to think about how to motivate people to do things. And so my question is, do you have any advice for this community that's grieving right now? How can we, whether it be lawyers, whether it just be regular people in the community, and when I mean regular, I mean non-attorneys, not saying that we're special or anything, but do you have any words of wisdom and how we can collectively come together in this moment in time?
Well, thank you for that very thoughtful question, Ebony. I want to say that I feel the pain that is in Jacksonville right now. I have many, many friends in Jacksonville, many former students in Jacksonville. Jacksonville, as you said, with A. Philip Randolph and, Mr. Trotter and, James Weldon Johnson and many, many others, has a long and deep history in this nation and in the nation within a nation that is the African American community. So, my thoughts are definitely with Jacksonville. I was very saddened when I heard what had happened there. I was also not surprised because I think that if you know anything about Florida history and you know anything about, Florida has a reputation of being kind of a progressive state for a southern state. Reputation for being a place that people mainly go to for palm trees and whatnot. But it has a very violent racial history. History that my wife, may she rest in power, disclosed about the area that you were educated in and that I lived in for 30-something years around Gainesville, where she talked about the Newberry lynching and many of those other lynchings that took place in that area. So there's a lot of that. And then if you look at that history, what you often see is a lot of that violence circulates around elections and also circulates around politicians who are saying demagogic things about African Americans. So I think that there's certainly, several politicians that are, well, at least two who are centered in the state of Florida who are saying things that I think probably create the atmosphere in which people think that going after African-American people who are minding their own business and trying to live their lives, they think that they're striking a blow for white supremacy, and that's a good thing. So I think that part of it is, as we confront that kind of situation, we have to stick together. We have to move collectively, sometimes collectively for our own defense. And at the same time, we need to call out people who are saying and doing things that are contributing to the kind of atmosphere that's putting our community at risk.
Thank you. And now I promise to switch a little bit back to.
I want to say one other thing that gives me a platform to say something about my history. You talked about the 1963 March on Washington. I think I was 5, 1963, but in 1983, they did a 20-year, 20-year, remembrance of the March on Washington, reenactment of the March on Washington, just like I guess a couple of days ago they did one. Gosh, what is that? 50 years, I think.
60. It was the 60th.
60 years. Okay. But anyway, in 83, I was in law school and I had a job in I was clerking, summer clerk for the Southern Poverty Law Center, Montgomery, Alabama. And there was a friend of mine who was from South Carolina who was really involved in politics and wound up, doing, working for the Democratic Party out in California, whatever. But at some point, we were both in law school. He said, "Hey, you want to go to this March on Washington?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "Okay." So he rode a Greyhound bus to Montgomery. I picked him up at the bus station. Then we drove up to DC. And when we got there, we found a student. There was a student at Howard. I don't remember his name. And I actually found some of this information when I was cleaning out my office at UF. But we had written a speech for this guy. And he was one of the speakers. He had going to be a youth speaker. So we went to him and we told him, "Look, you know, some of these other speeches that took place in March on Washington was John Lewis's speech. He was speaking for SNCC. And, they censored his speech because it was too radical and all that. But you got to speak for our generation. You have to say the things that we're interested in. You have to position yourself against war and against nuclear weapons and, against world domination and all those sorts of things. And, certainly, we're in favor of ending poverty and getting jobs and social justice and all of that. But, you have to speak our generation's perspective on that. So we wrote him a speech that, had that orientation. And, he gave it. It was not nearly as controversial as John Lewis's speech, but, we felt that we did a little bit of something. I was really kind of pleased with myself for having that involvement in the 1983 March on Washington.
And it's wild that you actually referenced John Lewis's speech, because I listen to that speech all the time, and I get chills whenever he gets into the part where he's like, "If you don't give what we want now, we're going to march on the streets of Washington, the streets of Danville, all these other places, because we're not going to stop until we have equality, or at least make it into God's vision." But back to you, I promise. You had mentioned that you had taken a gap year in between undergrad, and you were working at a library, and you had some experiences in prison. Can you kind of like expand on that and tell me how your experiences working with the prison, how that motivated you to actually go to law school?
Yeah, well, I think as I said, I worked at the Library Extension Services is what they called it, and it had a little office that was in maybe Haywood or someplace in the East Bay. And what we would do, one of the things we did two things, really main things. One is we had bookmobiles, and the bookmobile would drive around neighborhoods in just a wide variety of neighborhoods. Sometimes it would be in, like a urban inner city, so-called ghetto type environment. And sometimes it would be out in the country, and all the kids would ride up on their horses and stuff. So it was just very different environments. Alameda County is a very big, it's a huge county. So it's probably, it's a giant county, and just a lot of different environments there. But we'd also drive it, like for that one, we would drive the bookmobile inside of the Federal Correctional Institute, which was in Pleasanton. And so we'd drive in, and then, the prisoners would come in. Mostly, Pleasanton was kind of a soft, kind of placement for people who weren't, a security risk, usually white collar criminals and whatnot. So we really didn't have, it wasn't really much of anything to have people come in there. But we would stock different books for where we were going. So you'd stock kind of middle-class type books, self-help books and things like that when you're going to Pleasanton. But the other place we did is we did the Alachua County, the Alachua County jail. But there were two locations. One was more like a prison, and it was kind of outside and outskirts of Oakland somewhere. I'm not sure. Tracy? Not sure where it was, but it was in one of these outskirts areas. And you might run into fairly hardened people there, because there'd be people who would be held, for their trial, and they may, be charged with drug offenses or murder offenses, or, rape, or, whatever, serious felonies. There'd be people there. And that had a different type of book. You're usually a lot of Black books, a lot of, there were books by, there were this series of books by a writer by the name of Goins. Was it Harold Goins? Harold Goins, Goines. Maybe it was Harold or Dennis or something, but, the Iceman cometh, these kind of Black, Black, crime family type books. The Negro Bible was another one, but they didn't say Negro. There's these interesting kind of books that had kind of exposed me to a whole genre of things that I wasn't aware of, And then another popular book was, God, what was his? There was an autobiography of one of these Panthers. Was it? It started with an E. I can't recall the name right now. Having a senior moment, but Yeah, so we had different types of books, and you run across people. I mean, to me, those people were the kind of people I grew up with. So I was, I wasn't really intimidated by it, but some of them were people that reminded me of my cousins. So, we do that. And then the other thing that I remember is there's a courthouse in Oakland. I don't know if they still use it, but it was right by Lake Merritt. And in the top of that courthouse, there was a floor that was a jail. So that was the urban holding area. And then if people wound up serving a sentence, or they weren't actively at trial, or they hadn't been arrested the night before, or whatever, they'd go there. So we'd also service that area as well. And to me, I was like, this wasn't that long after, Huey Newton had been held for trial. And the Panthers, other Panthers, and the Panthers were still a presence in Oakland at that point in time. So to be able to go into that courtroom or into that courthouse and up to the holding area, up to the jail, where I'd seen pictures of and documentaries about and all that. I mean, that was kind of a heady feeling at that point. So that's what that was. But I just think that just the whole notion of learning about people who were in the community, and I think kind of a lot of us in that era had the perspective that all prisoners were political prisoners. And so we wanted to think about, well, what could we do to try and make their ordeal less terrible, and hopefully find a way to help them get freedom. So I think that having to think about that on a weekly basis when I went into that place, made me think about, well, maybe, being a lawyer was something I wanted to do.
And what kind of
particularly a lawyer who's focusing on criminal law, criminal justice.
And that was my question. What kind of classes did you take in law school?
Well, when I got to law school, I took, we used to joke about, when I got to law school, of course, I knew several people who had been undergrad with me. And then there were others who were there who became lifelong friends. Talked to one of my law school classmates yesterday on the phone who lives in Washington. We're trying to get together. But the thing that we used to laugh and joke about is how the list of required courses was different if you were Black. So if you were Black, there were certain courses you definitely want to take crim law. You had to take crim law anyway first year, but you want to take crim pro because you need to know about criminal law, need to take evidence because you need to know about what was going on in trial. You need to take, it's like if you're white, they say you want to take wills and trusts. But if you're Black, you want to take debtors and creditors remedies, because we need to know about things like, declaring personal bankruptcy and how, if you owe money to the credit card company, what they can do and not do. So there are certain things you want to focus your education on. And that's what I did, is I focused my education on all the things that I thought as a young Black attorney helping people in community, I would need that information for. So I took that. I took a class in public interest law, which turned into a great internship that I had later. And I took a class on prison law, which turned into an internship I had when I worked for the prison law office and was, basically located outside San Quentin. And I'd go into San Quentin every day. So, there were a lot of things that I got out of that experience. I took a class, there's a white man who passed away, but was a very prominent scholar. I think if you know anything about African-American history, the name will mean something. Herbert Aptheker. And Herbert Aptheker wrote a book he wrote a number of books about African-American history, but he wrote one about slave rebellions. He used the term slave rebellions in African-American in America, I think is what it was. But he was very involved in quote unquote what we call the movement at that point in time, because he had a daughter who got arrested at the same time that Angela Davis got arrested because they were friends. But he was actually a professor at San Jose State University, but he would come up and he would teach a class on African Americans and law. And so that was my first, I didn't know I'd wind up teaching that class, but that was my first introduction to African Americans and the law was from Herbert Aptheker when I was there. But yeah, so I tried to select courses that I thought I wasn't taking. I didn't take any, like corporate law type courses or courses that were focused on, wealthy people and wealthy people's issues. And I just didn't have an interest in it. And that's not where I spent my time.
It's really interesting that you conceptualize it that way, because I didn't even know why I took certain classes, but now hearing you kind of explain it, it makes sense in my mind. I took police practices with you, which is a criminal law class, but I took it because I wanted to know how the criminal system was working and impacting people like my family, because I do have cousins who are incarcerated. But I never thought about it that I was intentionally taking those classes for that reason. And so it would be interesting to, I don't know if anybody's done a study on this, but I'll look for it to see what kind of classes, elective classes that law students take and whether their, demographical background impacts that at all. But
well, that's good. I'll take a note of that because I don't have a pen around, but yeah, I might write that article if it's not.
Here we go. That's what this is for. But kind of one really quick question to confirm, you went to UC Berkeley, correct?
I went to UC Berkeley Law School. I went to Stanford undergrad.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then, so what was your first job out of law school?
Okay, so let's see now. All right, so all right, so my first job out of law school was at the San Francisco Public Defender's Office. But yeah, I'm going to give you a story of how I got to the San Francisco Public Defender's Office, because what I wanted to do was work in a impact litigation public interest law firm. And I wanted to do that because I was clerking. I told you how I had a class in public interest law. Mm-hmm. It was taught by a guy who was an attorney at a San Francisco public interest law firm that was called Public Advocates. And so I got to be a clerk, during school externship, whatever, over at Public Advocates. And at the time, Public Advocates was involved in a lawsuit against the California Department of Corrections. And they were suing around the prison conditions in San Quentin and Folsom Prison, in Vacaville. There's probably about 3 other prisons in the California system that were in that lawsuit. And so I got a lot of experience working with some really good attorneys, both from Public Advocates and some of the other, both, some of them were big firm law firms, and, there was another, kind of public interest firm that was involved. But there was a team of lawyers, and I was working with them. I was working with the expert witnesses that were being called. And I was like, wow, this is really, this is really great stuff. I enjoy this. And this is the kind of stuff I want to do when I get out of law school. So I applied, and I didn't get, there was a job at Public Advocates I didn't get. There was a job at the Center for Law and the Public Interest that's in Los Angeles I didn't get. I applied to NAACP. I didn't get that job. There's all kinds of jobs around the country that I applied to, and I didn't get any. And what I realized is that all of those jobs were jobs that were very difficult to get and were in a way elite positions, and they were hard to get. And one of the biggest problems I had in my resume was that I didn't have a clerkship. I hadn't clerked for a judge. And in my view, I was like, I don't want to clerk for a judge. I want to help the people, and I'm focusing on that. Well, 2 things. One is I didn't have the clerkship. The other thing is I was on law review. So I was losing out on these positions, the people who went to law, who had law review and had clerkships. I'm like, but they're not working for the people. You know, they don't have the same kind of experience I had. So I was a little disappointed. So anyway, there was, at one point in time, it was the same guy I went out to DC with, told me that there was that one of the county commissioners or county supervisor, I think they called him, in Alameda County was having a Christmas party. His name was John George. He's black. He was a black head of the county commission and, you know, fairly influential in the Democratic Party. And he said, hey, you want to go to this Christmas party? I said, anything that is a reception or a party that has free food and I'm a starving student, I'm going to. So I was like, yeah, let's go. So I went down there, and you know, maybe a week later, shortly later, I had an interview at the DC, not DC, the San Francisco Public Defender. So I go to Public Defender, and I have my interview. And I interviewed with some, you know, person, I can't remember who, some intermediate person. And so he says, okay, so now you're going to go interview with the head, you know, kind of the trial head of the agency, is kind of the deputy director. I said, okay, so I'll go interview with him. So I went to, he was a deputy second, whatever, public defender in charge. So I went to go interview with him. And we started talking, and he looked at me and he said, don't I know you? I said, I don't think so, sir. He says, weren't you at John George parties? I said, yeah, I was at John George's. And he says, yeah. He says, hold on. So he goes, he picks up the phone and he calls the public defender, whose name was Jeff Brown. Now, Jeff Brown was the brother of Edmund Brown, or otherwise known as Jerry Brown. Jerry Brown was not then the governor, but was the governor immediately before that. And at that point in time, he was running for president. So he was kind of a very heavy politician, and he was dating some famous rock star, Linda Ronstadt and all that. So he's kind of a big name. So he calls Jeff Brown on the phone. He says, Jeff, I got one of John George's boys in here. Should I offer him a job or whatever, you know? And so he gets to he says, okay, you're hired. And that was it. That was my interview. I got the job because of a reception that I went to in order to get food. I didn't have nothing to do with my qualifications or anything, but he thought I knew John George and I was, quote, one of John George's boys. But that, I'm just telling you, I'm telling you a lot of things in this story. Some of them has to do about, just, the way the world works, fortitude and, just happenstance, things just occur. But I'm also telling you a story about big city politics and the way things work and the way that you have to kind of be with this boss or that boss, and they're the ones who give you opportunity and direction and all of that. On that score, another thing that happened in that office is they'd come around every once a year or so. We had to make a donation to the Democratic Party. They would come to us and get those checks. So, that had something to do with it. But yeah, that was how I got that job.
Okay, and so the reason why I know you is you were my professor when I was at UF Law. So can you kind of explain what your motivations were for going into academia? Like, why did you want to teach law?
It's a very good question. I don't know if I've ever thought specifically about that. But one reason, I've always had an intellectual interest in the law. And I remember when I started later at the DC Public Defender, I was in the appellate division, and my supervisor would always yell at me because I was slow. And the reason why I was slow is I'd see a problem and I'd like, oh, man, that's interesting. And I'd start reading all these cases and kind of chasing, these issues down. He's like, we don't need all that. Just, give me the answer and be done with it. He liked to get to the point. And I was kind of always, easily distracted and going off on tangents and stuff. And so I think I've always had this intellectual interest in why is the law the way it is? What can it be used for? How can it be improved? What is its significance in terms of other social developments and social processes that are happening? How can the law both be an instrument for change and an obstacle to change? And so all of those are things that I've always been thinking about. But I think the first time I thought about law teaching as a possible career, first of all, when I was in law school, I can't say that I was enamored by law school. I liked all the things I was doing outside of law school. I did not like law school itself. I didn't like the classroom. Hated it, in fact. And I thought I was gone. I was like, when I graduated, I will never darken the door of a law school again. I'm happy to be out of here. But I think that what happened was, I had a job, before I went to the DC public defender and after I was at the San Francisco public defender, I worked for an outfit called the Southern Africa Project of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. And so when I was working there was another young attorney, and he was preparing to go into law teaching. And so I would, hey, what are you doing? And he's, I'm getting ready for the meat market. I'm doing this and I'm doing that. And he was explaining, I was like, all of this was like totally new to me. I had no idea what was going on, that this is the way that law profs are made, or, there's a process for it. I had never even thought about it. So I was just curious, and I was just fascinated by what you had to do to become a law teacher. And the gentleman in question, whose name was Sam, I was like, I didn't think he was like, he was like intellectually superior to me in some way. I mean, he's a smart lawyer, but I didn't get the sense that there was, he walked on water or anything. So seeing him do it, I was like, yeah, maybe I could do that. And he went through the process. He got hired. And I kind of forgot about that. And then later, my wife, at the time, my fiance, I'd met Patricia. We'd gotten engaged, and she promptly told me she was going to go to Tallahassee. And I was like, why are you going to Tallahassee? There's nothing in Tallahassee. She's like, oh, I'm going to get this PhD. I said, you get a PhD here. You don't have to go to Tallahassee. But, they're going to give me a full ride and blah, blah, blah. So she wanted to go to Tallahassee. And I was like, well, I got to figure out how I'm going to get to Florida. Well, I applied to every federal public defender in the state. Mm-hmm. Then I applied to most of the county defender offices that were, in North Florida, trying to get close to Tallahassee. And then some law firms in Florida. I didn't get a single response. Now, at that time, I'd had 6 years of experience as a public defender, a year of experience as a civil rights lawyer. I had probably dozens of trials under my belt. I had a great reputation as a trial lawyer. I didn't get any response. So I said, well, Florida's going to be a tough nut to crack. What else can I do? And that got me thinking about being a law teacher. And that's why I went to, when I was visiting Tricia at some point, I went past the Florida State College of Law spoke to Professor Alfini, that's what it was, Professor Alfini. And he encouraged me to apply through the central application process known as the meat market, and I did, and I wound up getting callbacks at Florida State and at University of Florida, and as they say, the rest is history.
Okay, two last questions. The first is, as a professor, were there any like intrinsic lessons that you wished your students learned? So we know that you in law school you get syllabi, and like you read through the syllabi, you have to meet certain things to learn so that you master, quote unquote, the subject. But is there anything that wasn't on the syllabus that you had hoped your students would learn by taking your classes?
Well, I think there's a lot of things. I mean, one thing I wanted them to learn is that, an African American, you could be an African American and think deeply about things. I thought it was important for me to model intellectual leadership for Black students as well as white students. And so I thought that was important. I always wanted my students to question the way things are. I did not want to teach criminal procedure, and as far as I'm concerned, I did not teach criminal procedure as if the way that we manage things in courtrooms around America are the way that things have to be. I think there are questions of power and social control that are built into not just the criminal legal system, but the entire structure of American law. And I wanted people to question those things, and to always ask why. And so that's why I would always say, what is law? Law is what you want it to be, and by making it what you want it to be, there was both the pragmatic aspect of that, which is it's what you as an advocate and an attorney can advocate for. And it's also what you as an activist can make it turn out into. I want people to really think about their own agency in that context. I don't want them to be thinking, oh, just give me, and I don't know if you remember this, but I was always say in class, and just tongue in cheek, I would say, well, if you go to Florida State, if they give you the book, you just read the book. You read the law book or the statute book. If you go to University of Florida, I want you to write that book. And if you're writing that book, I want you to be always thinking about why is this law, this regulation, or this, particular approach in the book? Why am I putting it here? What other things are affected by it? So those are the kinds of things that I want my students to think about. I want them to think more critically and broadly about the information that they're digesting.
Okay, and my last question, you probably don't remember this, but my first time ever meeting you was during the Black Law Students Association had a annual event where before orientation started, they had a boot camp for minority students. And so you are our professor speaker, and the year was 2018. And so a lot was going on during that year, and Donald Trump was president at the time. And the way that you kind of introduced us to law school was by saying that you are coming into a profession and your duty is to defend the Constitution. And so no matter where you end up in your career, the ultimate oath that you're going to take is that you must defend the Constitution. My question to you is, has your advice for incoming law students changed, or how do you think that incoming law students need to understand their duty when entering into the profession?
Well, you have a good memory, and first of all, but to answer the question, no, my advice is the same. Is that there are a lot of things that I think that I disagree with the present order of the way things are run in the United States, particularly in the government. But I never had any qualms about taking my oath. To me, that was important. And that the biggest problem with the American Constitution is, as I see it, as a man of color with some concern about social justice, is that it's not followed. And you can see that today. The thing that bothers me the most is how many people have listened to the siren songs of the Federalist Society and have put themselves in opposition to the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution and the requirement that all people have due process of law and be able to vote. Okay. And so the thing to me is there's a battle that's going on right now. That is going on right now to determine the direction of this country. And I don't think that, I mean, it's not just Jacksonville where these things might have to happen that we have to be concerned about, as we were talking about at the beginning of this interview. I think it's likely to be happening nationwide. And a lot of that is because there's some lawyers who forgot their oath to defend and protect the Constitution. I think that's critically important, especially more so now than ever.
Thank you so much, Professor Nunn. I've learned a lot, and I know that other people, whether it's this year, whether it's next year, who listen to this, hopefully will find the same kind of inspiration or curiosity that I have. But I really do appreciate you talking with me today.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to speak with you, Ebony, as always. I'm certainly impressed with how well you've done in your career since you've graduated. And, I know that as an old lawyer about to tie my shoes up, that the profession is in good hands with people like you.
Thank you so much. Okay, have a good one.
All right, bye-bye.